This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
To me, there's a certain irony, because I remember, I think Clausewitz said, when you attack a civilized nation, you go for the capital. When you attack an uncivilized nation, you go and kill the army, the chieftain and the army. And yet here, the strength is really, it seems to me, the strength with the advanced we talked about the earlier, and I'm going to ask you about this, the role of technology. Who's the most technological prowess? It's the Spaniards. But as you see, I'll just bring it up. One of the major battles of this is called the Battle of Otumba. And I think there's 800 Spaniards and maybe 1,000 and Spaniards, by the way, who are probably half strength. They're wounded, they're tired. They have 17, 18 horses, and they have 1,000 Mexican allies, and they're surrounded by an army to 10 to 20,000, and yet they win. Right. But to the Spaniards, if you take the uncivilized Aztecs, they have, it seems to me like you said, their spiritual source, the crux of all their activity is in the capital. To me, it's almost like a mismatch. But let's talk about the role of technology, because I think the average person would say, well, obviously the Spanish won. They had guns, right?
Sort of. I mean, I think they had more crossbows, arbalests, than they had, arquebuses.
Right.
So, and they had a very tiny number of horses, but of course, now there are millions of horses in the Western Hemisphere, thanks to the Spanish. But when they arrived, they were shocking on horseback, because they were like some mythical creature almost.
Giant deer. I think they call them giant deers, didn't they?
Okay, they might have. Yeah, I think of centaurs, of course, but I mean, the problem for the Aztecs was not necessarily the weapons. It was like three problems that they had. The weapons gave an edge, since most of them were swords, if you pardon the expression, for the Spanish. But the weaknesses, the brittleness of the Aztec regime, and the fact that it was not really, it was facing rebellions everywhere from other subservient satellite nations. And that was one problem. The other was the belief system of the Aztecs themselves. And there were these, if you look at the Quetzalcoatl literature, which really begins with the last period of the classical age, and you have what's known as the Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. And the whole sacred literature talked about the return of the Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, and his return would, in the Aztec sacred literature, mean a full circle in which Quetzalcoatl would overthrow Huitzilopochtli, who was the main Aztec deity. And so Moctezuma was frozen, petrified in fear that the prophecy of sacred literature was coming to pass. That basically, I think, immobilized his capacity to think clearly and try to get rid of Cortes early. And the time allowed Cortes to build coalitions, and that was important. The Aztecs, furthermore, didn't have, because they fought ritualized battles for prisoners, they were not in a position to adapt to the Spanish techniques in battle. And in any event, they were fighting the other allies of the Spanish in the traditional way anyway. So it was it was hard. If you look, let's look at North America during the, say, French and Indian Wars period. there had been a lot of interaction between Indian nations and both the French and the British. And it was possible to utilize Indian allies within the European context of battle, and really unusually adaptable and competent commanders like Howe. That would be Black Dick Howe's brother, who was unfortunately killed in 1758, right before the great battle at Ticonderoga, Carillon, in which the British Army suffered just an enormous defeat. He had developed a kind of approach to warfare in the wilderness that exploited Indian tactics and was able to operate in a different way successfully. And some of that was picked up by American colonial regiments as well, and would pay off big time in the American Revolution for the U.S. But the Aztecs were not in a position to think about adaptation at all, because the war approach was so bound up in religious needs, and that really hobbled their capacity to effectively operate. I mean, they were later on in the war, nearing the end, able to conduct some effective ambushes against the Spanish, and the Spanish lost a large number of people, but it was it was not a balanced situation that the Aztecs could turn around. So, I mean, in modern warfare, adaptation happens quickly. The Russians, for example, adjusted to the introduction of HIMARS very quickly and figured out how to disperse all of their stockpiles, battle ready lockers, if you will, serving the artillery, so they wouldn't get wiped out by a single strike. And then they were able to start jamming and targeting and shooting them down. And that's just a current example, but that happens all the time in warfare.
I heard
saw the bazooka, and within months they had the Panzer Schreck, which was better than the bazooka. And it's just that happens all the time. But this gets back to the cowboys versus aliens. I mean, the aliens were disadvantaged in terms of adaptation, whereas the Spanish, I would argue, could adapt very quickly because of their long crusading combat against the Muslim Emirates in Spain. So the Spanish had more cross-cultural capacity. You saw this in the French and Indian Wars, where for the longest time, the French had the advantage because they were culturally more empathetic and were able to develop rather intimate relationships with the Indian nations, Algonquin, the Huron, et cetera, while the British weren't. And I think this might be due also to religious issues. I mean, we can get into that at some point, but the fact is that something about the medieval experience, I think, made the Spanish more adaptable and more single-minded, more focused, more able to plan, more able to adjust, not just tactically, but also to adjust culturally. And there was no capacity within the Mexica to do that.
You brought, okay, so as a lawyer would say, you opened the door, because I had this written down, the role of religion. And what's so fascinating to me is, even though the Spanish they're Christians, I mean, make no mistake, people, they're Christians, but at that time in the history of Christianity, the Catholicism had become influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas. And who, by the way, was influenced, if I'm right, Aristotle, who really was reality oriented. So you can have your religion, but you also have a reality. You have to adapt to a reality.
Right.
Where you could say the Aztecs were really Platonic. This world doesn't matter. What matters is the abstract. That's why when Cortes is fighting them, he's not fighting them on their calendar. You can't fight now. We have a wartime calendar. You can't be doing this. And Montezuma, as you said, gosh, what a character. He reads to be very, very timid, or such a fatalist that he lets the enemy into the capital. Yes. He lets this superior enemy, and they know of their fighting capabilities. He allows them because he believes the God's will be done. I guess that's one way of saying it. So that's one thing I've realized reading this, just how unadaptable the Aztecs were, and how Cortes really did roll the punches. Did.
You could almost say that the Aztecs had deprived themselves of agency, because according to their cosmology and their belief system, they did not have agency. And at the same time, the world of now, the physical, pinch me world, was much less than the mystical, magical world out there beyond. And this is one reason that human sacrifice was embraced by those about to be sacrificed, as much by those wielding the obsidian blade. And the fatalism was more than fatalism. Fatalism is something that you can see in Buddhist and other religions, but even in Christianity and Islam. But this went way beyond that, and it's hard to really understand. And yet, there it is.
Doctor, I think of if there's one example in American history that at least I know of. I remember reading The Killer Angels long time ago, and the scene of day 3, with right before Pickett's charge. Longstreet's tells Lee, we can't do this. We can't do this. And what does Lee do? It seems like he gives up his free will. Just let God's will be done. Let him do it. Everything will turn out good. Ignoring the evidence. Now, I mean, that was my reading, but at least to me, that's an example of it.
Well, I think within the Christian tradition, fatalism can be a kind of permission, where you say, things have reached this point, so from here on in, everything's in God's hands, and it gives you a way out. Whereas among the Mexica, at least, nothing was in their hands really, and they were at the mercy of this vision that they created for themselves. And there's also, I think, there was more cultural, what I'd call prehensility. It's like the whole German Fingerspitzengefühle.
Feeling of the battlefield.
Yeah, well, it's because I don't want to use the word empathy. It's a sense of what's going on. What's going on in the other culture, because what you see remarkably in Latin America that you do not see in North America in terms of relations with the what the Spanish would call the indígena, the indigenous ones. You see a higher sense of compassion and ability to connect. I mentioned the French doing this in Canada. They would be much more intermarriage. So trappers in Canada would marry the First Peoples, as the Canadians say today, and that happened a lot. In fact, it became a kind of force within Latin America. So that's why Mexico today calls itself Mestizaje. It's mixed. It's, we're not white and we're not Indian. We're mestizo. Mestizaje is actually the foundation of post-revolution political thought in Mexico. And you see this in two ways around the time of Cortes and after. One is the person of, and he's almost a counterpoint to Cortes, is Bartolome de las Casas. And he became the defender and the he wasn't a salvational figure, but he fought for the rights of indigenous peoples. And he was at the same time as Cortes, and he had tremendous influence and effect on things. And the whole mission system, for all of its problems, was still, I think, authentically a way not simply to civilize the conquered peoples, but to offer all of the spiritual framework that would uplift them. And this was a sincere and indeed a core element of the Spanish mission. And you can see that Franciscans and Dominicans and others had this prehensility, because you have Father Sahagún, who is translating all of the Aztec literature into Spanish. And how does he do that? I mean, he didn't go get a degree in anthropology or linguistics, but he did it, and a tremendous achievement. And it shows a deeper understanding of humanity. And the British and Northern Europe, the Protestant ethic is much more severe. I mean, if you look at the Puritans, even the Quakers, but certainly the Dutch Calvinists and others, they're very tough.
No free will, right? It's no agency.
Well, you have the key here, I think, is predestination, and the fact that there are the elect, who've already been saved, and then there are and so you see a very, very different kind of slavery as an institution and slave trading emerge in Northern Europe, much more as an enterprise, whereas slavery is very different. There was huge amounts of slavery in pre-conquest Mesoamerica, and the Spanish made efforts after the conquest to pare that down as much as they could. I mean, there was slavery in parts of Latin America, but generally an effort was made to prevent that form of chattel slavery, which was so prevalent in the Protestant operations, that led ultimately to the Civil War. And you also had Cortes didn't enslave his allies when the war ended. They all became Spanish grandees. They became aristocrats. And the position socially of the indigenos did decline over time, but in large part, it was due to the collapse of population in Mesoamerica due to European diseases, that they were not like aliens. If you think about H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, how was the invasion of the Martians stopped? Well,
That's right.
Well, the same thing happened in Mesoamerica, but it was terrible. And sort of, 80, 85, I don't even know. A majority of people died within a couple generations. And as a result, whatever social order had been regnant, had been in charge before the coming of the Spanish, was broken down. But even so, the Spanish acknowledged and protected to a degree the rights of the caciques, the local leaders. So they were still local leaders, and we all have to remember that Mesoamerica wasn't conquered in a day. I mean, Cortes conquered the Aztecs, but then there were many campaigns that were made in Central America and in the north, and in all of those campaigns, there was a really important element of the Indigenous Allies in the conquests that were made after. So I'm just looking here at a book that's called Indian Conquistadors, and it shows in the conquest of Michoacan or Oaxaca, Jalisco, Yucatan, Guatemala, Honduras. You've got all of these peoples here. You've got it's hard for me to read here. Tarascan, Tacleca. Oh, they're right here. There are at least 13 different nations that are contributing forces for the conquest of Mesoamerica. And so it's not a unitary, monolithic sort of conquerors and then the subjugated. It's much more like what the Romans would do. And if you became a Roman ally, that came with a lot of benefits. Mm-hmm. And even if you were defeated, if you submitted to Rome, then you could be embraced by Rome. You could be rewarded. You could become Roman. So it's really in a long tradition. So there's this disruptive, chaotic event, the conquest. But there's also weird kinds of continuity and weird kinds of syncretism. And one of the reasons that Catholicism was so successful in the Americas was that practices, rituals, and sacred objects and people, deities, were incorporated into the Catholic cosmology, so that people could find new Catholic names for the gods that were important to them, that sort of framed their life, and so this syncretism is very important, and it's exactly, by the way, what missionaries did in Europe itself at the end of the Roman Empire. So just one easy example is Easter. We talk about Easter, but that's not what it's called in the Mediterranean world, Pascal, the lamb. Why is it called Easter? Well, Easter was a mother goddess in Britain. And their rituals, their May Day rituals, so-called pagan rituals.
Yeah.
So you replace those pagan rituals with Easter.
Oh, wow.
So the whole Christian calendar incorporates, pieces of the world that preceded it. And,
sure.
And there were thousands of shrines where there'd be little local gods. And they just replace the sacredness of the pagan shrine with, Mary, or,
right.
Or the tears were transferable, in other words.
I remember a long time ago, I read, I read 3 volumes of Fall and Decline of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, and there's that famous, I think, chapter 14 where he gives a history of Christianity, to which he was called an atheist for even writing. It's a fantastic read. Last night, preparing for this, I think you'll get a kick out of this. Okay, I know who Neil Young is. I know some of the songs. I did not know that he wrote a very famous song called Cortes the Killer. No clue. I looked it up. It's one of the top 100 American songs. And in it, he describes Cortes as killing in large numbers these peaceful people called the Aztecs. And he talks about killing peaceful people who knew no war, and by the way, whose people purposely sacrificed themselves to the nation. It was so disingenuous that even Rolling Stone in the 70s had to come out and say, this is not historically accurate.
Well, that's the difference between the 70s and the woke world we live in today. Is today they'd say, oh, he's telling the truth. Any contrary view is misinformation and racism. So, we have come a long way too. But anyway, I think, the only people who were sort of peaceful like that, and they weren't totally peaceful, were the Caribs, in Cuba when.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the story is so complex and interesting, and the role that Cortes played was not really of a conqueror, but more as a liberator. You can see him in that context. And the initial post-conquest Mesoamerica was more of a Roman kind of continuity. It was really the giant die-off, that horrible tragedy, which no one could have at that time could have foreseen. That it altered the balance, not of power, but just the social equilibrium that followed the conquest.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Now, it's my understanding that Clausewitz once said, that a strategy will take on the character of the person who designs it, of the leader. Would you call this the Cortes's campaign of, I think audacious, absolutely audacious. I think that's one way to put it. Would you say that that this campaign really shows who he was as a man, his particular traits and qualities as a leader?
Well, of course. And those traits and qualities include charismatic leadership and an ability to take advantage of opportunities. So that's where sort of intuition comes in. But also, the sort of belief in one's own destiny and a tremendous drive to make it. I mean, Cortes was the whole latter period of his life was, he made the conquests, and then everything began to go downhill after that, because he was not made viceroy of Nueva España, and he was never treated as he felt he should have been treated. Master of the universe, yes, but the establishment will always come get you, and the Spanish establishment did. And this is a problem for Caesar too, as his 50 stab wounds will attest.
Yes. To me, that's one of the biggest, I guess you call it ironies, or I don't know what would you call it, but the fact is this man conquered a new world. He really did. It just changed it. And militarily, a success, maybe even politically a success, but on a personal level, this man wanted recognition. He wanted, the king, here's my man Cortes, and it did not happen, despite the absolutely amazing feat that he orchestrated, that he personally orchestrated. I don't think anyone else, of my reading of it, I don't think anyone has had the kind of character and just laser-like focus that he did. Well,
there are lots of figures like that in history. Some of them are absolutely, monstrous people. On the other hand, it says something about Spain that it could have produced this man, and not just one man, but you've got Magellan, obviously Columbus, although people say, oh, he's just an Italian, a Genoese, but no. Then you have endless, and including guys like Bartolome de las Casas. They're not just warriors, and they go on and on and on for this period of what you could call peak Spain, and a society that can create that kind of capacity among individuals has some heft to it in civilizational terms. And this is, of course, what worries me about the United States today. And I'm having taught at the Naval War College for some years, and taught at the graduate level about war and strategy all of my career since 1980. I see an America that is all about submission within its military, and it's all about playing it safe and building your lifestyle, building your status within the system. And a country that is so oriented toward enhancing status and wealth is going to be incapable of rising to real challenges.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's my great worry about America. And of course, with Spain, this is also kind of funny. Spain, at the time of Cortes, obviously under Carlos V, was riding high, and even under his predecessor, his successor, Felipe II, it reached real heights. And then in the reign of Philip IV, and I mentioned that, when Spain was having greater and greater difficulty maintaining its dominance in Europe, there was a whole group of intellectuals in Madrid that were worrying about decline, and things were coming apart. And part of that speaks to the inevitable consequences of success. So over a century, Spain had been doing so great, but then it got into tremendous debt, and it could no longer handle enemies on every front. You can't make an enemy and fight a war with England, and then fight a war with France, and fight a war with the raging lion of the North, Sweden, and then an 80 years war with the Dutch, and then a crusade against the Ottoman Empire on three fronts. And frankly, that looks a lot like the U.S. today.
I was going to ask you. Yeah. You got you're everywhere. You're going bankrupt.
You've got a canary in the coal mine. When you have the intellectual class worried about decline and the end of empire, well, then maybe you should listen to them and look at what's going on. But the U.S. now is engaged. I mean, it has an elite a ruling class, better yet, that is solely about its own rank and privilege, social status, and above all, wealth, and doesn't care a thing for the people. And we have a military that looks good on paper, gauged by how much money we spend. But it's what Mao would used to call a paper tiger.
Wow. Yes. Could you teach Cortes in the campaign today at the Naval Academy? Would they even allow this?
Well, I actually put together a proposal for an entire module, on a case study on Spain in the period of, again, Carlos V to Philip IV. And, several of my colleagues liked it, but got nowhere because, I don't know. I mean, one thing that struck me about the War College was it was more about indoctrination than education. And the one thing it would not examine would be case studies that might reflect on the U.S. situation today.
Really?
You'd be surprised. So if you were in the Vietnam module, the questions, and you have to understand this is a nearly 200-page syllabus. It told you everything you needed to think about all of the case studies that were in the War and Strategy course. And in the question that leapt out in the worst possible way in the Vietnam module was, could the U.S. have won the war in Vietnam? And I just think, well, just asking that question is going to encourage people to come up with right think that is wrong. And the other one was, I would protest at our faculty meetings, and I'd say, well, we're doing the American Revolution, and we're doing it as an exercise in tub thumping and boosterism, like we're cheerleaders, and isn't it great? And the U.S., almost a miracle. We could have, we almost lost, and yet somehow we were able to turn things around. I said, wait, we shouldn't be looking at the colonial American side at all. We should be looking at the British.
How did they lose it?
And how did they make the wrong assessments at every turn? How did they do too little, too late? Like the Carlisle mission, how did they reach a point where they could lose two armies and have all the great powers in league against them at the end of the war? How did they manage that? And they didn't look at the British. They looked at how the Americans won, not how the British lost.
I read a book years ago, Command Culture, about the officer, German and American officer education, World War II, and me being a 6 years active duty officer, I always remember doing vignettes, little slivers of what could happen. But reading Command Culture by Jörg Muth, I think, Muth, the Germans would just say, hey, war starts or the battle starts, end it. And you do these war games, it could take days, but you didn't stop until you won. Where I just remember, here are the borders, comply with them, stay within the borders, don't think outside that box. And what would you do? And
that's interesting.
Doctor, I have friends I graduated with, some now, I mean, many are retired of the Army, some are some of these think tanks. They unfollowed me because I've talked to Colonel McGregor, because I'm asking the questions you're bringing up. It's just talk about a story of cowboys versus aliens. I feel like I'm living in an alien culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is the fate of every super successful enterprise. You can say empire if you want, doesn't have to be an empire, but there's a reason that they begin to start arcing downward. And the reason is their success and the culture that's bred. And it isn't just a culture of being complacent or lazy. It's that generations that succeed the successful, victorious generations, after 3 or 4 generations, they feel entitled. And they can't imagine anything but victory. I mean, the perfect example is the sanctions on Russia. They were going to crush Russia within a couple months. And instead, they came close to crushing us. I mean, we had to do a lot of fancy footwork to get that gas to Europe. Now, it's just an inability to assess, follow through, and to lose sight of how you got to where you are. And everything becomes ritualized. And people can only think of the ritual and how am I going to do? Will I ever get FaceTime with the emperor? So it's not a good scene. And of course, the main thing is about later stage empires is that all of their energy goes into maintaining their belief in the status quo, their conviction that everything's cool. And so it means maintaining illusions. And the maintaining of illusions has been so remarkably exposed during this war against Russia. And it's really shaken me to the core to see that people can spend so much energy to successfully lie to themselves.
Yeah. Doctor, this has been a fascinating discussion. I got to tell you, I think it's one of my favorites. I was mesmerized. This is
Plato. I mean, I can't compete with Plato.
This was great. This was great. Where can our listeners find you? You send me some podcasts. I see you on Twitter. And you do writings every now and then, right? Where can we find you?
Oh, I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. I have a couple articles there, and you can just Google me, and many articles will come up. And I'm also engaged. I'll be a senior editor at a new magazine called Aegon, and I should be appearing there very soon as well.
Well, I hope it goes great for you. That's a dumb. That's sorry. That's a dumb joke. The audience is booing me right now. I can hear them.
I missed it. So don't worry.
Well, listen. Again, thank you so much for doing this. This has been really, really exciting for me. I feel like I got energy for the day to actually do some other work now. So thank you.
Excellent. Wonderful.
And yeah, and I look forward to seeing more of your writings. And let's stay in touch.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Take care.
Take care. Thank you, audience. Thanks for watching. If you like this content and want to see more of it, please subscribe. If you want to learn more about chaos and how it deals with leadership, then sign up for early access and new information about my upcoming book, Strength in Chaos, A Leader's Guide to Mastering the Uncontrollable. Check it out on thechaosbook.com. See you later.